I woke up that morning with a jolt, my heart pounding. The radio was blaring, and I recognized the voice instantly. It was Elvis, the king of rock and roll. But something was different. It wasn't just the music, it was the feeling. I felt like I was being pulled into a story that I didn't know I was a part of. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the city. I could see the record store down the street, the one where I bought my first Elvis album. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was 1956, and I was just a kid, but that album changed everything. The cover with Elvis in his gold lame suit was everywhere. People were talking about it, and I had to have it. I put on my favorite jeans and a t-shirt and headed out the door. The streets were quiet, but the air was electric. I walked to the record store, my mind racing. I picked up the album and ran my fingers over the cover. The repeated image of Elvis was mesmerizing. I played the album at home, and it was like nothing I had ever heard before. Hits like One Night, Don't, and A Fool Such as I were on there, and they were amazing. But the album was only 22 minutes long, which seemed weird at the time. It didn't matter though. The music was magical. I went to school that day, and everyone was talking about Elvis. The girls swooned, and the boys tried to imitate his moves. It was a different world, and Elvis was at the center of it. But as the years went by, things changed. Elvis went to the army, and when he came back, he was different. He had a deeper voice, and the music was more mature. The album Elvis is Back came out in 1960, and it was a game changer. It had a mix of genres from blues to rock, and it was in stereo. The thrill was back, and I felt like a kid again. But then the movies started. GI Blues was one of the first, and it was a hit. The album had a ballad called Doin' the Best I Can, which was beautiful, but it wasn't the same. Elvis was trying to appeal to a broader audience, and it showed. The next year he released his Hand in Mine, a gospel album. It was different from anything he had done before, and it was amazing. His voice was perfect for the songs, and it felt like he was singing straight from his soul. The years kept passing, and Elvis kept making albums. Some were great, like Elvis is Back, and some were forgettable, like Something for Everybody. But no matter what, Elvis was always Elvis. He could take a simple song and make it something special. Blue Hawaii was a perfect example. The ballads on that album were some of the best he ever did. Can't Help Falling in Love is still one of the greatest songs ever, but then things started to go downhill. Kissin' Cousins was a disaster, and the album was just as bad. It felt like Elvis was losing his way. But even in the worst of times, there were still moments of magic. Harum Skarum was one of the worst films, and the album was no better. But there were still songs like So Close Yet So Far that showed Elvis could still deliver. I Remember the Day How Great Thou Art came out. It was a gospel album, and it won Elvis his first Grammy. The songs were powerful, and it felt like he was back on top. But the movies kept coming, and the quality varied. Spin Out had some good songs, and Speedway was a limp effort. But through it all, Elvis was always there, always singing, always making music. I sat down and looked at the stack of albums I had collected over the years. Each one had a story, a memory, a piece of my life. I put on Elvis is Back and let the music take me away. The world outside didn't matter anymore. It was just me, the music, and the king of rock and roll. I remember when I first listened to the soundtrack from the 1968 TV special. The music was fantastic, but it just didn't sound as good on the record. The live parts were a bit messy, and there was even a weird noise in one of the medleys that sounded like someone was vacuuming in the background. It's a shame because the music is so great, but it's best to hear it in the 4-CD set that came out years later. The sound is much better, and you get to hear the songs in the right order. I gave it a 6 out of 10. In 1969, Elvis recorded some of his best stuff. The songs from Elvis in Memphis are legendary. Tracks like In the Ghetto, Long Black Limousine, and I'll Hold You in My Heart are just amazing. It's like Elvis finally grew up and started singing for adults. It's hard to pick a favorite because there's not a single weak song. I rated this one a perfect 10. Another 1969 release, From Memphis to Vegas, From Vegas to Memphis, was a bit of a strange mix. It had a live album from Las Vegas and a studio album from Memphis. The live part, now called Elvis in Person, is great, especially the 7-minute version of Suspicious Minds. The studio part, back in Memphis, is also strong, but it takes a few listens to really appreciate it. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Let's Be Friends in 1970 was a budget album with songs from Elvis's movies. It's not bad, but it's not the strongest either. The song Almost from The Trouble with Girls is really beautiful, and hearing Elvis sing I'll Be There is always a treat. The CD version has a shorter version of Mama, which is a bit disappointing. I rated it a 5 out of 10. On Stage, February 1970, was a different kind of live album. Elvis sang a lot of pop and rock standards he hadn't recorded before. The Wonder of You became a big hit, and songs like Polk Salad Annie and Walk a Mile in My Shoes are now closely tied to Elvis. It's one of his best 1970s albums, and I gave it an 8 out of 10. In 1970, RCA released a big 4-LP set called Worldwide 50 Gold Award Hits, Vol. 1. It was basically a greatest hits package to celebrate Elvis's return to form. All the tracks are available elsewhere now, but it's still a great summary of his early years at RCA. I rated it an 8 out of 10. Almost in Love was another budget release from 1970 with songs from Elvis's late 1960s movies. It's surprisingly good and sounds pretty modern. The UK version has a cool cover too. It's a good way to discover some of Elvis's best material from that period. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Elvis's Christmas album from 1970 was a mix of songs from 1957, 1966, and 1969. It's a classic, and the songs sound even better here than they did on the original releases. This was the version of Elvis's Christmas songs that a lot of us grew up with. I gave it a perfect 10. That's the Way It Is, from 1970, is one of Elvis's best albums of easy listening material. It has live recordings from Las Vegas and studio tracks from earlier in the year. Songs like I Just Can't Help Believin' and You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' are amazing. The live versions of I've Lost You and Patch It Up are a bit weaker, but overall it's a great album. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Elvis Country, from 1971, is another one of Elvis's best albums. It's a mix of old and new country songs, and it's often called his concept album because of the snippets of I Was Born About 10,000 Years Ago between the songs. It's a bit of a stretch to call it a concept album, but there are some amazing performances, especially Tomorrow Never Comes and whole lot of shacking going on. I gave it a perfect 10. You'll Never Walk Alone, from 1971, is a collection of Elvis's gospel material. It has some songs from the Peace in the Valley EP and a few others. It's not essential, but it's pleasant to listen to. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Love Letters from Elvis, in 1971, was the first sign that Elvis's comeback was starting to fade. It has mostly weak tracks from 1970, overdubbed with woodwind and horns that make it sound like elevator music. It's not even really an album of love songs. I gave it a 4 out of 10. Come On Everybody, from 1971, was a budget album with tracks from some of Elvis's 1960s soundtracks. It's a bit of a strange release, but it's still enjoyable. I gave it a 5 out of 10. The Other Side's Elvis Worldwide Gold Award Hits, Volume 2, from 1971, is a 4-LP collection of B-sides and EP tracks. Most of the songs were already on albums, but it's an interesting compilation. It's not essential now, but it's still a 7 out of 10. I Got Lucky, from 1971, continues where Come On Everybody left off, with more tracks from Elvis's 1960s soundtracks. It's not as good as Come On Everybody, partly because of songs like Yoga is As Yoga Does. The song I Need Somebody to Lean On is great though. I gave it a 4 out of 10. Elvis Sings the Wonderful World of Christmas, from 1971, is one of the most depressing Christmas albums ever. Elvis doesn't sound very interested, and the songs are mostly morose. He does a great job on a Snowy Christmas Night and Merry Christmas Baby, but it's mostly hard to listen to. I gave it a 5 out of 10. Elvis Now, from 1972, was a missed opportunity. It has some good songs like Early Morning Rain and I Was Born About 10,000 Years Ago, but it should have been much better with all the great recordings Elvis had made. I gave it a 5 out of 10. He Touched Me, from 1972, is a gospel album that won Elvis a Grammy. It's not as good as How Great Thou Art, but it has some great songs like the title track and Reach Out to Jesus. It's a bit of a mixed bag though. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Elvis Sings Hits from His Movies, Volume 1, from 1972 is completely pointless. It has songs that aren't even hits, like Confidence and Old MacDonald. It's a waste of time. I gave it a 1 out of 10. Elvis as recorded at Madison Square Garden, from 1972, is a live album where Elvis gives an energized performance. He sounds great on songs like Proud Mary and Never Been to Spain, but the original mix was a bit dry. The 2012 remastered release is the best way to get this material. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Burning Love and Hits from His Movies, from 1972, is another budget album with Elvis's single, Burning Love, and songs based on folk or classical music. It's not the best use of Elvis's material. I gave it a 4 out of 10. Separate Ways, from 1972, is another budget album with a hit single and songs from different eras. It's pleasant but low-key. The cover with Elvis straddling a motorway is pretty weird. I gave it a 5 out of 10. Aloha from Hawaii via Satellite, from 1973, was a big deal, but Elvis's performance wasn't his best. His voice sounds a bit nasal, and the performance is laid back. Still, there are great songs like I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry and My Way. The Legacy Edition with the rehearsal show and intimate songs is the best way to get this album. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Elvis, The Fool album from 1973 is one of Elvis's most low-key albums. It has some good songs like the piano tracks from 1971 and For Lovin' Me, but most of the other tracks are mediocre. The album is short, and it's a bit of a mystery why the Dylan Jam was cut so short. I gave it a 5 out of 10. Raised on Rock for All Time's Sake, from 1973, has more upbeat songs than most of Elvis's 1970s albums, but he sounds tired. The title song doesn't make much sense for Elvis to sing, and Three Corn Patches is one of the worst Labor and Stoller songs. The soul and funk tracks are good, and the ballads are more reflective. I gave it a 5 out of 10. Elvis, A Legendary Performer Vol. 1, from 1973 or 1974, was a package of master recordings and unreleased live performances. It had some great songs from the 1968 TV special, but it's redundant now. It charted well, though, and led to more volumes in the series. I gave it a 5 out of 10. Good Times, from 1974, is a budget album with songs from Elvis's 1972 sessions. It's not the strongest album, but it's still enjoyable. The cover with Elvis in a jumpsuit is pretty cool. I gave it a 6 out of 10. I remember when I first heard about Elvis Presley, he was more than just a singer, he was a legend. In 1973, Elvis came back to Stax, and they made 2 albums from those sessions. The first one wasn't that great. Sure, there were a couple of good songs like I Got a Feeling in My Body and Talk About the Good Times, but most of the other songs were a bit boring. I mean, Take Good Care of Her was so weak. It made me wonder what Elvis was thinking. But that's okay, because not every album can be a hit. The next year, in 1974, Elvis went live on stage in Memphis, and they recorded it. This album was one of his best live ones. Elvis was really into it, and you could feel the energy. He played some amazing songs like Trying to Get to You and How Great Thou Art, which even won him a Grammy. It was like being right there in the concert. The Legacy Edition has the whole concert, but honestly, the shorter version is better because it keeps you engaged. Also in 1974, they released Having Fun with Elvis on stage, but it was a bit of a joke. It's just Elvis talking and laughing, without any actual songs. It's not something I'd recommend unless you're a die-hard fan who wants to hear Elvis's funny side. In 1975, they finally put out another album from those 1973 Stax sessions called Promised Land. This one was much better. It had some great country songs and a really rocking title track. It wasn't a huge hit at the time, but looking back, It showed that Elvis was getting back into his groove. RCA, Elvis's record label, also released Pure Gold in 1975. It was a mix of old hits and album tracks from different years. It was popular because it was cheap, but the song selection was all over the place. It's one of those albums that's good for a few tracks but not the whole thing. Today, from 1975, was really special. It was like a sequel to Elvis Country, but it didn't get much attention at the time. Now it's considered one of Elvis's best studio albums from that period. Songs like Trouble and I Can Help show just how talented he was, even when things weren't always easy for him. In 1976, RCA released A Legendary Performer Volume 2, which was more alternate takes and live performances. It was a bit random, but it had some cool stuff that fans would appreciate. The Sun Sessions album from 1975 in the UK and 1976 in the US was a game changer. It was the first time all of Elvis's early Sun recordings were in one place. It's a must-have for any Elvis fan because it shows where it all started. But things took a turn with From Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee, in 1976. Elvis's voice wasn't as strong, and the album was mostly slow, sad ballads. The only good song was Danny Boy, and even Hurt wasn't as impressive as some of his earlier work. Welcome to My World in 1977 was a country-themed compilation. It had a couple of new tracks, but it could have been better if they included more live performances. Still, it was better than his studio albums from that time. Moody Blue was Elvis's last album before he passed away. It was a mix of studio and live tracks, and some of the songs like Way Down and Moody Blue are classics. Even though Elvis was struggling, he still managed to deliver some great performances. After Elvis died, RCA released Elvis in Concert in 1977. It was from his last tour, and it's a bit hard to listen to because Elvis was really sick. But there are a few good moments, like That's All Right and I Really Don't Want to Know. It's a sad but important part of Elvis's legacy. In 1979, Our Memories of Elvis was released. It was supposed to be a more stripped-down look at Elvis in the studio. It wasn't perfect, but it was a good concept, and it showed a different side of Elvis. Elvis Aaron Presley in 1980 was an 8 LP box set that had a lot of rare and unreleased stuff. It was organized by theme, not just chronologically, which was a cool idea. It had something for everyone, from early live recordings to alternate takes. A Golden Celebration from 1984 was another box set, but this time it focused more on early Elvis. It had a lot of alternate takes and private recordings, but the sound quality wasn't great. Still, it was important because it showed that RCA was starting to treat Elvis as a historically important artist. Essential Elvis, the first movies, in 1986 was a European release that came to America a couple of years later. It had the master takes from Elvis's first 3 movies and a bunch of alternate takes. It was a big deal at the time because it showed a side of Elvis that not many people had heard before. Stereo 57, Essential Elvis Volume 2, in 1989 was all about the recordings from early 1957. It wasn't his best period, but it was still interesting to hear him working in the studio. Some of the alternate takes, like Peace in the Valley, were really cool. Hits like Never Before, Essential Elvis Volume 3, in 1990 focused on 1958. It had a lot of unreleased stuff, and the highlights were the alternate takes of King Creole and the unedited version of Crawfish. Collector's Gold, in 1991, was a 3-disc set of unreleased material from the 1960s. It had movie songs, Nashville recordings, and live concert recordings. The live tracks were especially exciting because they included songs that were rarely heard live. Double features in the mid-1990s was a series of 10 CD that re-released the 1960s soundtrack recordings. They were remixed to sound better, and some had unreleased songs and alternate takes. The non-Formula Films disc was the best of the bunch. If Every Day Was Like Christmas, in 1994 combined Elvis's 2 Christmas albums with some alternate takes. It was the best release of this material during the CD era, even though the 1971 recordings were a bit gloomy. 100 Years From Now, Essential Elvis Volume 4, in 1996 was all about the 1970 sessions. It had alternate takes that sounded really different without the overdubs. The alternate version of Bridge Over Troubled Water was especially beautiful. Platinum, A Life in Music, in 1997 was a 4-CD set that told Elvis's story through live recordings, alternate takes, and private recordings. It was one of the best Elvis box sets ever released. The home recording of Tennessee Waltz and the alternate take of You'll Never Walk Alone were highlights. Brightest Star on Sunset Boulevard in 1998 was a bootleg of recordings from Elvis's 1970 Las Vegas rehearsals. It showed Elvis working hard and trying out new songs, which was really interesting. The home recordings in 1999 was a risk, but it was a fascinating look at Elvis's private moments. Some of the tracks were edited, but the 1966 recordings, especially If I Loved You from Carousel, were eye-opening. Such a Night, Essential Elvis Volume 6, in 2000 was the last in the Essential series. It focused on recordings from 1960 to 1964 and had some strong alternate takes. It was a good way to wrap up the series. Live in Las Vegas in 2001 was a 4-CD set with complete concerts from 1969 and 1970, plus some soundboard recordings from 1974 and 1975. The 1969 and 1970 concerts were worth the price alone. Memphis Sessions in 2001 was all about the outtakes from the 1969 Memphis Sessions. It wasn't perfect, but it had some great alternate takes, especially of Power of My Love and Suspicious Minds. Today, Tomorrow, and Forever in 2002 was another 4-CD set with alternate takes and live performances. It wasn't as strong as Platinum, but it had some nice moments and the first official release of the 1956 Little Rock concert. Close Up in 2003 was a 4-CD set that mixed soundtracks, Nashville recordings, and a concert from 1972. The main draw was the concert from the Elvis on Tour documentary, which hadn't been officially released before. So High, Nashville Outtakes, 1966 to 1968, in 2004 was a collection of outtakes from those years. It showed Elvis experimenting and trying out different styles, which was really cool to hear. I flipped through the pages of my Elvis Presley collection, feeling a mix of excitement and nostalgia with each turn. The stacks of CD and albums tell a story of a man who was more than just a singer. He was a legend. One of my favorite discs is this collection of outtakes from 1966 to 1968. It's a period when Elvis was doing some of his best non-soundtrack work. The How Great Thou Art sessions are especially powerful, and songs like Guitar Man, High Heel Sneakers, and You'll Never Walk Alone show just how versatile he could be. The disc isn't perfect, but it's a great snapshot of a time when Elvis was really hitting his stride. I give it a solid 7 out of 10. Another disc that catches my eye is I Sing All Kinds from the Follow That Dream label. It focuses on Elvis's 1971 recordings, and while the performances are a bit hit or miss, there's still a lot to love. The mix of seasonal and non-seasonal songs might not be the best idea, but the sound quality is decent, and it's a must-have for any serious Elvis fan. I'd rate it a 6 out of 10. The complete 68 comeback special is a real gem. It finally brought together all the unedited live segments from Elvis's iconic TV special, along with the original album and the dressing room rehearsals. It's a bit of a mystery why it took so long to release, but the music is incredible. The only small complaint is that some bonus tracks weren't integrated back into the medleys they were meant for. Still, it's a 9 out of 10 for sure. Nevada Nights is a 2-CD set from 1974, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. The opening night performance is interesting because Elvis changed his repertoire a lot, but the audience didn't seem to respond well. The sound quality isn't the greatest, but there are some unique songs that make it worth a listen. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Elvis as Recorded at Boston Garden 71 is another concert that was available as a bootleg for a while before it was officially released. It's from a time when Elvis was really back in form after some rough patches. The sound isn't perfect, but the energy is there, and it's a good representation of his 1971 performances. I'd rate it a 6 out of 10. The Chicago Stadium, set from 1976, is a double disc that shows Elvis in surprisingly good form for that year. The sound quality is excellent, especially on the second concert, and while he struggles a bit on the ballads, he's fantastic on songs like Steamroller Blues and You Gave Me a Mountain. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Young Man with the Big Beat is a 5-CD set that includes all of Elvis's studio recordings from 1956, plus outtakes, interviews, and live performances. The highlight is a newly discovered Louisiana hayride performance from December 1956. It's a bit pricey, but it's worth it for the historical value. I'd rate it an 8 out of 10. Elvis at Stax from 2013 is a 2-CD set that includes all the songs recorded at Stax Studios in 1973, plus alternate takes. It's not the most exciting listen, but it's a good way to explore the Stax sessions. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Way Down in the Jungle Room from 2016 is a 2-disc set of Elvis's last recording sessions. The first disc has the master takes, and the second has alternates. It's not his best work, but it shows he could still deliver when he was committed. I'd rate it a 6 out of 10. The Hometown Shows is a double disc with 2 Memphis concerts from 1974 and 1975. The 1974 show is especially good, and has the best sound quality you'll find on a soundboard recording. Elvis is in great spirits and voice, and it's a must-have for any fan. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Finally, A Boy from Tupelo is a 3-CD set that includes all of Elvis's recordings from his Sun Records days, plus outtakes and live performances. It's the most historically significant Elvis release in a long time, and it's a perfect way to start any collection. I'd give it a 10 out of 10. Each of these albums tells a part of Elvis's story, and they're all worth exploring for anyone who wants to understand the king of rock and roll. I remember the day I picked up the old newspaper with the headline, Elvis Presley, Lack of Responsibility is Shown by TV in Exploiting Teenagers. It was a chilly November in 1956, and everyone was talking about Elvis. Some folks were excited, others were worried. The TV shows were showing him, and it was causing a stir. People were saying he was a bad influence on the kids, but I didn't see it that way. To me, Elvis was just a guy who loved music and wanted to share it with the world. A few months later, in March 1958, I read about Elvis in another paper. It talked about his private life. It was a bit different from the usual stories. It showed that Elvis wasn't just a performer. He was a real person with feelings and a family. It made me think about him in a new way. In July 1956, I saw a story about how Elvis rose from nothing to become a top song star at 21. It was amazing to read about how he started at 11, singing in church and at school. It made me realize that even if you come from a small town, you can still make it big if you have talent and work hard. I remember feeling inspired by his story. August 16, 1956, was a big day. The Daily Mirror published an article titled, "Do We Want This Shockin' Rockin'?" It was a question a lot of people were asking. Some thought rock and roll was too wild, too rebellious, but for me it was just fun. It made me want to dance and sing along. In October 1960, the same paper reported that Elvis broke a record. It was a big deal. He was selling more records than anyone else at the time. It showed that even after all the controversy, people still loved his music. March 21, 1963, was a different kind of day. The Daily Mirror wrote, "It's slow, man, slow for Elvis. It seemed like things were changing." Elvis was still popular, but the music was evolving, and so was he. It made me wonder what he would do next. In August 1963, Good Housekeeping had an article called Caged Lion. It was a bit different from the usual fluff pieces. It talked about how Elvis was feeling trapped by his fame. It was a glimpse into the pressure he was under, and it made me realize that being a star wasn't all it was cracked up to be. December 4, 1968, was a special day for Elvis fans. Variety reported on his TV special, Elvis. It was a comeback, and it showed that he still had it. The special was a mix of old and new, and it reminded everyone why they loved him in the first place. In 1970, I read an article in the Arizona Republic about the Presley era and where it had gone. It was a look back at the impact Elvis had on music and culture. It made me think about how much things had changed since he first burst onto the scene. March 10, 1957, was another memorable day. The Lawton Constitution wrote about how teens thought rock and roll was fading. It was a bit of a surprise because Elvis was still going strong. But it showed that even the best things don't last forever. September 10th, 1956 was a big day for Elvis. The Elmira Star-Gazette reported that he had to curb his act on a TV show. It was a sign of the times. People were still a bit unsure about how to handle his energy and charisma. March 1993, I read an article in Elvis, The Man and His Music about The Colonel Speaks. It was a fascinating look into the mind of Elvis's manager, Colonel Parker. It gave me a new perspective on the business side of things. December 5th, 1975 was a big day for Elvis. Variety reviewed his show, and it was clear that he was still a force to be reckoned with. It showed that even after all these years, he could still put on a great performance. October 18th, 1970, I read an article in the Arizona Republic about the Presley era and where it had gone. It was a reflective piece, looking back on the impact Elvis had on music and culture. It made me think about how much things had changed since he first burst onto the scene. These stories and articles were more than just news. They were a part of my life, a part of the culture I grew up in. They showed me that Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a symbol of a time when music could change the world. Even though things changed and new stars came along, Elvis's legacy lived on. He was, and still is, the king. I flipped through the pages of old newspapers and magazines, each one a snapshot of a different time in Elvis Presley's life. I'm learning about how people saw him, what they thought about his music, and how he changed over the years. In 1956, Elvis was just starting to become a big deal. The Moberly Monitor Index wrote about him signing with Ed Sullivan, which was a huge deal because Sullivan was one of the most famous TV show hosts. The Monroe Star News talked about how teenagers went wild at his shows. They were so excited that they even broke up the show. It's crazy to think about how much of an impact he had on people, but not everyone was a fan. Some people, like the editor of the New York Times, thought Elvis was just a passing fancy. They didn't believe he would last, but of course, Elvis proved them wrong. He kept getting bigger and bigger. In 1957, Elvis made his first movie, Love Me Tender. The monthly film bulletin said it was okay, but not amazing. They thought Elvis had potential, but he needed to work on his acting. That same year, the Arizona Daily Star wrote about Elvis doing Christmas carols, which was a bit of a surprise for some people. They weren't sure if Elvis and Christmas music would go well together, but it turned out to be a hit. By the 1960s, Elvis was a movie star. He made a bunch of films like Blue Hawaii and Follow That Dream. The monthly film bulletin had mixed feelings about these movies. They liked some but thought others were a bit silly. In King Creole, they said Elvis did a good job, but in Tickle Me, they weren't so impressed. It's interesting to see how different people had different opinions about his movies. Around this time, Elvis was also dealing with some personal stuff. Modern Screen wrote about how he was overweight and not feeling well. It's hard to imagine the king of rock and roll struggling like that, but he was human just like the rest of us. In the 1970s, Elvis was still a huge star, but things were changing. The San Mateo Times talked about how he was getting older and heavier, but his fans still loved him. The Los Angeles Times reviewed his movie Speedway and said it was okay, but not his best work. It's clear that by this point, Elvis was trying to reinvent himself and stay relevant. One of the most touching articles I found was from the New York Times in 1977, right after Elvis passed away. They wrote about how he had changed the face of culture and paved the way for the 1960s revolution. It's amazing to think about how one person could have such a big impact on the world. Reading all these articles, I realized that Elvis wasn't just a singer or an actor. He was a cultural icon, a symbol of a whole era. People loved him, hated him, and everything in between. But no one could deny his talent and his influence. It's a reminder that even the biggest stars have their ups and downs, and that's what makes their stories so compelling. I remember when I first heard Elvis Presley. It was the mid-1950s, and the world was changing. Elvis was at the heart of it all, a young man with a voice that could shake the ground. Critics were divided, some loved him and others hated him, but no one could deny his impact. In 1956, Elvis made his first big screen appearance in Love Me Tender. The reviews were mixed. Some liked the movie, but others found it too sugary. The New York Times called it a holiday from culture, which didn't sit well with Elvis's fans. Despite the criticism, the movie was a hit, and it launched Elvis's film career. Elvis's music was everywhere. His songs were topping the charts, and he was performing on TV shows like The Steve Allen Show and The Ed Sullivan Show. On The Steve Allen Show, Elvis sang Don't Be Cruel and Hound Dog, but he had to tone down his usual energetic performance to fit the show's style. Steve Allen later defended his decision, saying it was about giving Elvis a different platform. The fans, though, were wild. They screamed and fainted, and sometimes the shows had to be stopped. In one instance, a crowd of 12,000 teens in Chicago almost caused a riot. The police had to intervene to keep things under control. Elvis's fans were passionate, and they didn't care what the critics said. Elvis's next movie, Loving You, came out in 1957. It was more autobiographical, and Elvis played a character named Deke Rivers. The movie was a bigger hit than Love Me Tender, and it showed that Elvis could act as well as sing. Critics were still divided, but the fans loved it. One review in Variety called it a screamer, which was a good thing in Elvis's world. The 1960s saw Elvis continuing to make movies and music. Flaming Star in 1960 was a Western, and it got some good reviews. The New York Times called it a flaming start, which was high praise. Elvis also appeared in G.I. Blues, which was another hit. The movie showed Elvis in the Army, and it was a big part of his comeback after his military service. Elvis's concerts were always a spectacle. In 1965, he performed in Las Vegas, and the shows were a mix of old and new. He sang his classic hits, but he also tried new material. The reviews were mixed, but the fans were always there, cheering him on. One of the most interesting parts of Elvis's career was his music. He recorded a lot of different genres, from rock and roll to ballads. Some of his ballads, like Can't Help Falling in Love, became classics. Even though he was often criticized for his performances, no one could deny his talent as a singer. In the 1970s, Elvis's life took a different turn. He continued to perform and make music, but his health started to decline. His shows in Las Vegas were still popular, but the pressure was getting to him. The reviews of his performances in the 1970s were more mixed, and some critics were harsh. Despite the ups and downs, Elvis Presley remained a legend. His music and his performances influenced generations of artists. Even today, people still talk about Elvis and his impact on music and culture. Whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that Elvis Presley was one of the most important figures in the history of rock and roll. Elvis Presley's journey through the 1950s and early 1960s was a wild ride. From a young, rebellious singer to a Hollywood heartthrob, his fame soared, and so did the controversies and the highs and lows of his career. In 1957, Elvis was everywhere. He was rocking the charts, selling out shows, and making headlines. People were either mesmerized by his energy or scandalized by his hip-shaking. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote, "Elvis rocks, his fans roll, capturing the essence of his performances, but not everyone was a fan." Some religious leaders, like Reverend Candy Rison Hoover, called him a threat to decency. Despite the criticism, Elvis's popularity only grew. He was the king of rock and roll, and his fans were loyal. As Elvis transitioned into the 1960s, his career took a new turn. He started making movies, and while some were hit, others were miss. His first film, Love Me Tender, was well received, but as he continued to churn out more movies, critics began to notice a pattern. Many of his films were formulaic, and some, like G.I. Blues and Blue Hawaii, were criticized for being too commercial. The New York Times even called him a reformed wriggler, suggesting that he had lost some of his edge. Despite the mixed reviews, Elvis's music continued to resonate with fans. He released hit after hit, including Can't Help Falling in Love and Return to Sender. His voice was unique, and his stage presence was undeniable. Even when he wasn't at his best, people still flocked to see him. The Billboard charts were a testament to his enduring popularity, and his albums consistently topped the charts. Elvis's personal life was also in the spotlight. He had a well-publicized relationship with actress Anne Margaret, and his return to television on The Frank Sinatra Timex Show in 1960 was a major event. It was clear that Elvis was still a force to be reckoned with, but the pressure was mounting. He had to balance his music, his films, and his image, all while trying to stay true to himself. By the mid-1960s, Elvis was a household name, but the world was changing. The Beatles and the British invasion were on the rise, and the music landscape was shifting. Elvis's style, once revolutionary, was starting to feel a bit dated. Critics like Bosley Crowther of the New York Times were harsh, calling his films a commonplace batch of films, and suggesting that Elvis was becoming a caricature of his former self. But Elvis wasn't done yet. He continued to evolve, experimenting with different genres and styles. His religious beliefs also came into focus, and he began to incorporate gospel music into his repertoire. In 1963, he released His Hand in Mine, a gospel album that showcased a different side of him. It was a reminder that Elvis was more than just a rock and roll icon. He was a complex individual with a deep spiritual side. Elvis's impact on popular culture was undeniable. He had changed the way people thought about music, fashion, and entertainment. His influence extended far beyond the charts and the box office. He was a symbol of rebellion, a king of rock and roll, and a cultural icon. Even as his career faced challenges, Elvis remained a legend. His legacy was secure, and his fans continued to adore him. As the 1960s rolled on, Elvis's journey continued. He faced new challenges, but he also found new opportunities. His story was far from over, and his impact on the world would be felt for generations to come. Elvis Presley was more than just a star. He was a phenomenon. And no matter what the critics said, he would always be the king.